We start part 5 by looking in at Renoir around 1910. This is a little bit farther down the line than where we are at the lecture, but again, I like to do kind of the self-portrait along with photograph technique. You can see in the painting, he's probably feeling quite old. You can see a skull almost underneath the skin that he has there, and once he reaches this later point in his life, we know that he develops really, really bad rheumatoid arthritis. So again, he continues to work, but at this later point it does become more and more difficult. The period that we're going to check in on is this period a little bit after the Impressionist exhibitions, where he's kind of wondering what he wants to do with his work and what direction he wants to go in. He decides to travel to kind of see the old master's work that this was traditional for artists to kind of go around Europe to these home countries of the more famous artists to explore their work. So he goes to Algeria, Madrid, Venice, Florence, and Rome, and continues to travel through Italy, and then will eventually find his way back to Algeria. The first country we're looking at is Algeria, and again, both of his times there are going to be kind of mixed together here into one body of work. But if you think about this in reference to the Odalisque painting that we have very early on with his impressions of what Algeria was from his Orientalism phase, you really see the reality of Algeria here rather than this kind of made-up version. Again, there's a warmth and pleasantness to Renoir's pictures, but this is especially true when we view this young lady sitting on close to the ground on a rug. Again, this pattern work that was probably so fascinating to Renoir in capturing this little itty-bitty details all along the back border. And again, very much like he paints many of the people, very bright and warm. Here's an outdoor view of the Bay of Algiers, again in Algeria. This looks like this could almost be in the French countryside. This looks, again, impressionist in kind of technique, but he's also pulling back closer to reality. When we look at the wall there, made of stones, you can kind of see this difference between the two. And again, in the foreground, we have this wonderful, wonderful scene, very Renoir in the sense of the wide range of palette of colors that you can experience. Again, this must have been a wonderful time for him, coming from such a poor background. This was probably the first time when he had enough money to travel and do the things that many of the artists had done. As I mentioned, going to these other countries and seeing this area firsthand is kind of very important to artists at this time, before there's areas of mass communication like the internet. Now, while he's in Algiers, again, the reason he's there is as much due to Delacroix as anything else. This influence that we have, we know the Delacroix, of course, traveled as well. Another outdoor scene, the Ravine of the Wild Women from 1881. One wonders where the wild women might be, but the kaleidoscopic Renoir is seen here once again. You can see the blues and the reds within the vegetation, but this must have been a very nice time for him, just being able to go to a different country and feel a different vibe or different energy and be able to capture that free of what he can think of going on at his home in Paris. A little bit more time to find himself and really expose himself to new things, new colors from natural vegetations, things of this nature. This is a very, very important period within Renoir's work. He does a very good job of making us feel part of the landscape, with the flowers very, very close to the foreground. You can almost see them nestling up against his canvas. Here, the step in Algiers, 1882, a wonderful scene full of very chromatic. Again, we have a veiled woman in the foreground, these steps leading off into the distance, showing what you can do with the Impressionist technique. And again, the wonderful skies that he must have experienced and these new landscapes really invigorates Renoir in a different direction. And we see a kind of a vibrance returning to his work, in my opinion, during this time. And again, I think a lot of this is just him being able to travel and seeing a different country and being exposed to a different climate as well. There really is kind of a harsher contrast between what we think of him painting Algerian women who were, of course, not from Algeria, rather from Paris, and how he's capturing them here. Again, here they don't seem as an object. They're much more part of the landscape, much more natural, part of what you would consider the environment, and not a subject of a particular adoration. But, when we look at the portraits that Renoir does during this time period, it is still very Renoir. Again, if we look at this woman's face, very, very realistic, and as we kind of move farther and farther away, we get more and more of the hazy impressionistic technique. In both of these images, again, the kaleidoscopic Renoir, you can see the whole range of colors. Looking at the woman, you can see the red flowers and the yellow, and then, of course, the blue that's actually in her clothing, and then going over to the landscape. Again, palm trees, something you wouldn't necessarily see in Paris, but you'll notice that the shadows on the ground are blue. Although this is a very realistic type of scene, it seems that Renoir has picked up certain lessons from his time painting outdoor scenes in the Impressionistic style, and is bringing that over in a sort of translation, if you will, into what's occurring in this scene. And Renoir does a wonderful job of painting children again, even when we look at the children like the little Algerian girl from 1881. Here we do have a little bit more of a haziness to the face, but again, the whole combination of colors. And we get this wonderful joy that we always feel from the Renoir paintings, especially his paintings of children who remind us of the innocence and frivolity of life, oftentimes something we can forget as we get older. There's always something kind of striking about the way he paints the eyes of people, and the way that you can kind of connect with them almost instantly when you stare directly at the canvas. Again, when you look at this, you start with the child's face with those deep, intense, dark eyes, and then we kind of move around the rest of the composition, enjoying the color. And again, the brush strokes, the way he's composing the canvas, very close to how we feel about the child. We move on to Venice, where Renoir would have gone to see Titian amongst many other masters. And again, Venice was a very popular spot for most of the Impressionists. At some point made their way over here. Of course, Monet did. But when you think of the amount of water that we have and the reflection of water and in reference to the landscape, especially reflecting on the water, this would be a good place to kind of observe those atmospheric effects that make the Impressionists so incredibly popular. Again, a very nice composition. You can see he's created the horizon line about a third of the way up in the space. Again, little splotches of red to balance out the very, very deep blue that we have. Green splotches of light on the surface of the water, showing the reflection of the light as it dances across the water's surface. Again, with this type of effect, this type of atmosphere that you would get in this location, this type of area would probably bring one back to the Impressionist effects. When we look at something like this and his treatment of the water, again, the reflections of light on the surface of the water are really what we're looking at as much as anything. You can very plainly see the brush strokes on the surface of the water. And again, when we think of this blue boat and this green reflection that we're getting off of it on the water surface, once again, Renoir is using his entire palette rather than concentrating on just one or two colors to generate a particular sensation. In the background, we have this atmospheric effect of the buildings as they hazily become more and more part of the background and less identifiable. This is also true of the boats. And in the very, very center, we have this very olive-colored sail with a red tip. Going to the Piazza San Marco, again, you can see that while he's in Venice, it's almost like he's rediscovering what Impressionism can do for him. You look at the sky and the way he's treating the ground, it almost looks like it's covered with the snow reflecting the light. And then we have the gold of the domes of San Marco in the distance, again, reflecting what we see. You notice the people on the left side of the composition, they really do become diffused more and more and really become part of the landscape at certain moments. It's hard to tell which parts of these are people and which might be parts of some type of architecture, especially as we follow that blue off into the left corner down the street on the left side of the piazza. It's also interesting how he uses the brushstrokes in the foreground to kind of bring our eye back to the San Marco in the distance. Here we have Mount Vesuvius in the morning, and I enjoy this painting because it gives us a little peek into what Italy would look like in 1881 with all of these wonderful carriages in the foreground. Again, an excellent use of composition, but we see this hazy effect. We see the haze in the air, but also on the water. And as we bring forward to the streets, it continues. As I mentioned, if this was this trip to kind of free him of the Impressionist techniques, when we look at the work he's doing, most of it is in this vein, especially in these more outdoor scenes where we see again this kind of fluidity of brushstroke within the dynamics of his work. As mentioned, he goes through Italy to study a lot of the classical masters, the Renaissance masters, if you will, that you would be able to find there. And again, kind of rediscover what it was about art that was important to him by looking at these. And it was at this time, of course, when he was in Italy that he meets Richard Wagner and paints this portrait of Wagner. Very famously, he did this portrait in, I think it was a little bit over a half an hour. But we again remind ourselves of what Renoir does for a living and what he really does get the majority of his money off of, and that is these portrait works. So he travels around, and as I mentioned, he kind of begins and ends in Algeria. He actually contracts pneumonia while he's in Italy, and by his doctor's advice, he actually goes back to Algeria in order to enjoy the warmer climate, if you will. And again, that's where we kind of see that second body of work developing. But he does return to Paris, and again, with kind of a different set of ideas about what he wants to do with his work based on the masters that he was able to see in his travels through Italy, Spain, etc. So we see this painting from 1881, again, a pretty famous Renoir painting. If you look at all of the wonderful colors we have, a bright red in the very center, composition featuring two people rather than one, again with a very small child. It's hard again to look at something like this and not feel some sense of joy. And again, when we look at the composition, it's very full, but at the same time, Renoir creates a separation between the landscape and the individuals by creating this darker color base on the dress itself. But if we look at the face, again, this is much more realistic than even the paintings we were seeing him do while he was in Venice. And again, when we think of things like this is much more what we associate with Renoir leading forward into the next time period. As I mentioned before, one of the things that we really see with Renoir is a lot of portraits of children, and when we look at this wonderful study, we can see the mastery of what he really has. We have different postures of these different children getting ready to do portraiture, but again, if you look at the range of emotions, this is really the enjoyable thing about this painting, from the solemnness of the young lad down at the bottom to the face of the little girl where it almost looks like she's either eaten something too cold or too warm. We have the joy of a much older girl moving down, and again, two portraits of the baby side by side, looking at both the front and also the sides to get kind of a full range of what the child would look like. Again, Renoir would go paint many children's portraits throughout his career. This is something he really is renowned for, and again, you can really see why. It's not so much that he's capturing the children, but he's capturing a certain amount of joy that we understand from childhood, and again, that's what we really want to see. In addition, we have portraits like this of Charles and George Durand-Ruel. Again, Charles Durrell is a very, very famous art dealer. This is them much younger, and you can see the interweaving of the Impressionist technique, again, in and around the face. Here we have much more solid blotches of color, especially in the background with the foliage. It's almost like he's using a thinner brush to create the fabric of the clothing here in the foreground, and with both of the gentlemen between the blue and this grayish suit. Again, it's a wonderful picture, wonderful response to who these people probably were, very responsible for making his name who he was. So again, portraits of these people are something that we'll see again and again throughout Renoir's work.